morning. Good morning. Oh boy, I hope you guys are doing as great as you look. You just look like you're amazing, so maybe you're doing amazing. I hope you are. The reception next week, main thing you need to find out over the next week and a couple weeks is how you can be praying for Zach and Elizabeth as they move to Maine. I don't know, do you guys realize there's Yankees up there? Yankees are the weirdest people on earth. They're really odd. How many Yankees in here? Yeah. We have a little support group for the Southerners that have to put up with the Yankees. But Zach and Elizabeth, we're excited for you and your the next chapter of your ministry and how God is going to use you guys in Maine. And they don't have barbecue up there, they have lobster rolls, I'm told. I've never had a lobster roll. I don't even like lobster, I don't think I like lobster. I like shrimp. But, are they the same? Who knows? So we're going to have a fellowship for them at 11 o'clock, so immediately after the 9:45 service. We don't need to bring up but 2 tables. That's all we need to bring up when we crash this room after the end of this service next week. And we'll just push the chairs to the side and have a fellowship time. Be a great time. If you want to bring a card for them, you can do that. I encourage you to do that and write them a personal note. It goes by really, really fast. You know, that hour or 2 hours of that fellowship time will fly. So you want to say something, you can say it to them, but also so they can remember it. And when they get up to Maine, we want them to be so sad and missing us so much that they just cry and cry and cry over looking at the cards and the letters from us. So keep that in mind. All right, we are in the book of 2 Corinthians this morning, chapter 12, and we're in a series called Scars. Scars. Anybody got a scar? You remember your first scar? It was always at the expense of somebody. You got it because of somebody else. They caused it to you. My first scar was on my forehead. I was probably in 2nd or 3rd grade on the playground at Highland Park North Elementary in Topeka, Kansas. And I remember we had, I think, this girl's hat or something. It was cold out. And we had her stocking cap or something because I was wearing a stocking cap. And we were running outside this group of kids. And Wade Godsey, a friend of mine, was running around the outside of the other way, opposite directions. And we hit my head to his mouth. And his tooth broke off in my head. And I remember that only because I got to go home from school early that day, because that's what you get when you get a tooth in your head. So kids, if you want to get out of school, find somebody that's got some loose teeth and pop your head right into them and get a scar. Now, I used to have a hard time finding that scar because it was in my hairline, but, well, through the course of time, that hair has kind of gone back. And there's that scar from Wade Godsey's tooth. Later on. So we all got scars. And you know, scars are life's tattoos. And we all go through things in our life that we understand where they come from. We understand why they happen. But then there's also things that we don't understand why they happen. You know, for the mature Christian, for the one that really has a deep, deep relationship with Jesus Christ, they've been through some struggles. They've been through some difficult times. That is just true. Whether you want to believe it or not, whether you want to accept that or not, there's a lot of casual Christianity. There's a lot of casual Christianity these days. There's a lot of casual Christianity being preached. But the Apostle Paul is going to share something with us this morning that is really hard to understand, and it really devastates our theology about God and about what He allows into our life, what He allows to bring into our life. First of all, we began the series with these 2 questions as we continue. We'll go a few more weeks with this. Pastor Zach will be preaching next Sunday to close out his ministry here. I'm excited to hear what God has laid on his heart. But the 2 questions for this series are this: does God use pain in our Does God use pain in our lives? Does God cause pain to accomplish His will in us? You know, we see God working in some incredible ways in the Scripture, some great ways, but we also see Him acting in some ways that we cannot understand or even comprehend how He would do that or why He would do that. But what is the thing in your life that is that would bring the most scars to your life? What is it about you, about your faith, about your spiritual life, about who you are as a follower of Jesus Christ that would cause the most scars to come into your life? Well, we're going to see from the Apostle Paul this morning, he got this pain in his life, this scar, because of his pride. And I would venture to say that every one of us struggle with this. Whether you realize it or not, you struggle with pride. You can say, well, no, I don't have a good self-esteem. I don't, I always think that I'm not good enough. I always think that, well, that's still, psychologically, that is a source of your pride, that you're wanting to be, it's still from that same thing, because pride, we know, was the original sin, and pride is something that we will struggle with as long as we're in the flesh. Pride is something that every believer struggles with to some way. And here's how God was dealing with it in Paul's life. And maybe we can see this is how He's dealing with it in our life. You know, God has to continually draw our attention from ourselves to Him. We're prone to always draw attention from God to ourselves. You think about how you even serve Christ. You want to be noticed. You want to be thanked. You want people to be able to pat you on the back. Nobody recognizes me doing it. It's all pride. And we always want God to reward us for this. If we don't get rewarded, well, God, why didn't you reward us for this? Why didn't you bless me? Because look at how faithful I am. Look what I'm doing. There comes from that pride. And we continually have to struggle with this issue. And it could be the very reason that we have scars in our life because of that. Well, our text this morning is 2 Corinthians chapter 12. If anybody had reason to be prideful as a follower of Jesus Christ, it was Paul. Paul was chosen, handpicked by God to be His light to the Gentiles. And because of that, God was using him in some great and mighty ways, not only writing Scripture that we can enjoy this morning, that we can learn from and glean from and grow from, but also He was using him to plant the early churches in the first century church, and they're planting these churches. He's seeing Gentiles coming to Christ, and He's bridged this gap between what was to what is and to what's going to become. And God is using him in some incredible ways. And along with that, he was given some great visions and revelations that not everybody was having. And God was using that in a great way. And in response to that, as Paul's telling this church at Corinth, I had some great revelations and all these mysteries and these things that I understand and these things that I'm able to tell you about God. But then look in verse number 7. Chapter 12. So, to keep me from becoming conceited because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me and to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. So here is Paul in this situation, and he's having all this incredible success for the Lord. He's seeing the gospel go forward and the gospel go out, seeing lives change, seeing churches being planted. And along with this, God doesn't want him to become conceited, and Paul is having to deal with his pride. So he gives him this, and Paul calls it a thorn in the flesh, and this is Paul's scar. Now, probably the most well-known affliction from the Bible, but you can look at it. We looked at last week several examples of people in the Bible that God used greatly. He also hurt them deeply, or allowed them to be hurt deeply, because they couldn't be used any other way. But here's this most well-known affliction in the Scripture, Paul's thorn in the flesh, and yet he doesn't say what it is. We don't know specifically what it is. But we know that it was substantial. We know that it was big enough that he would even write to the churches, and he probably talked to his fellow believers in Christ about it. He doesn't want it. He wished that God wouldn't give it to him. But we know it was serious. And the Greek word that is used for thorn is better translated stake. There's a difference between a thorn and a stake. I've had thorns. We've all been stuck by thorns. But what about a steak? Have you ever been stuck with a steak? No, I've eaten a steak. I've stuffed a steak in my mouth, but I've never had a steak. I mean, that's bigger. That would cause more damage. And Paul describes it that way. There's this stake in my flesh. And a lot of different speculation about what it could have been. Probably it was a physical thing. I like to believe, just because of my own experience, that wasn't the reason that wasn't what the affliction was, but most scholars believe it was some kind of a physical affliction, something real and tangible. And you think about some certain pain that you go through in life. Do you ever wonder, I wonder if this is what Paul's thorn was, this certain kind of thing in my life. Have you ever had kidney stones? Anybody? Oh, those are like so painful if you've ever had kidney stones. I mean, that will bring you to the fetal position in no time. Very, very painful. But we know it was probably a physical affliction. Paul endured a lot of physical violence. He was beaten. He was left for dead. And that would cause some residual damage in his body. And it could have been something from that. Maybe it was a broken bone that didn't heal right. But he experienced a lot of these things. So it could have been something from that. Some people think that it was an eye disease. He was writing to the church of Galatia, and he says, I know that you care so much about me that you would even gouge out your eyes to give them to me. And some would say that scholars think that it was some kind of an eye disease, and maybe they continually watered, and it was kind of uncomfortable even to look at him because of his eye disease. Well, I tell you, a visible thing like that right on your face, that would tend to make you very humble, because of other people would be uncomfortable even to be in your presence, even to look at you, if it was that. But if it was Paul, he just couldn't see good, whatever it was, maybe it was some kind of an eye problem that he had. But it could be also this, since he referred to this thorn as a harassing messenger of Satan, it could have been severe spiritual or psychological struggles that he had. Maybe he dealt with depression. Maybe he dealt with some kind of a oppression on his life that way, because he says this thorn in the flesh was brought to me by God as a messenger of Satan. But it could have also been, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 28, the previous chapter, Paul is talking about how he had such anxiety for the churches. Now here's this great believer, this mighty man of God, and he's planting these churches, he's seeing these churches grow and begin to reach people with the cause of Christ, and he had great anxiety for them. And he details in chapter 11 and chapter 12 how there were different people that continually tried to come in and disrupt what God was doing. So they would come in and distract, and you need to do this also. You may say, okay, this Christ stuff is good, but it's not enough. You also need to do this. You also need to be that. And Paul continually struggled, even though he called himself a Jew of the Jews, a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He always had to struggle in his ministry fighting the Jews who were wanting the new believers to live according to the Old Testament law. And Paul was like, no, that isn't what we're about. And it was distracting, because then it became less about the Messiah. And so he had this anxiety for the churches. And so this is what I think his thorn in the flesh was. I think it was people. I think it was people. Because you can understand or accept certain physical problems or things, but people you just don't understand. And I think in Paul's case, these are people that should have been on the same team, but for whatever reason, they were not. They were not. And so, Paul, you're not doing it right. I know you were called by God and I wasn't, but you're not doing it right. You're not saying the right things. You're not preaching the right things. You're not doing the right things. And so that is my vote. Because we see these false brothers that are constantly dogging him, wreaking havoc in the churches that he planted, always coming in and subverting the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's what it is. But whatever it is, we can relate to it, because most of us have something. Whether you go far as say it's like a thorn in my flesh or a stake in my flesh, I don't know if it would be that kind of an ailment. My problem of physically would be my feet. My feet just hurt all the time. Been thinking about preaching 3 services, maybe bringing out a stool. Abby told me, maybe Dad, you need to bring your stool from the garage. And yeah, maybe I need to. Abby, I need to bring that stool. When they rebuilt my heels that were crushed in the car accident, they say the one on the left needs to be redone and they've done all they can for the one on the right, but my right foot hurts worse than my left, and they want to redo my left. So I'm like, I'm leaving things the way they are. I'm not doing it. But when they rebuilt my heels, you know, your heel is they say is the worst bone in your body to break. But they took bone from my back and they rebuilt my heels. Then they eventually, on each heel, they took apart all the screws, and after they healed up enough, and then they put a pin up through the bottom of my heel, up into my ankle on both of my heels. So the one on my left, it didn't take, and so they said it's like a post in the ground that you move around, and so it's not lodged there, so it's moving around, and that's what's causing your problem. So whatever, we all have something. And it's amazing that I've talked to people and they have things that are 10 times worse. I'm sitting there going, I'm so glad I don't have to deal with that. I'm so glad I don't have that issue in my life. But you have something. It may not be big. It may be big. It may have been big. I mean, the scars that we accumulate in life are absolutely mind-boggling. If we knew about them in advance that we were going to have to go through this in our life, we would not want to continue in our life. We would beg God for something to be changed. But the point is this, it's not the thorn. It's not the thorn. That's not the point. The point is God's purpose for the thorn. What are you learning from it? What have you learned from it? What have you learned about yourself? But more importantly, what have you learned about your Heavenly Father, your God? Because God pierces for a purpose. And you would think, as difficult as Paul had it, that God would at least give him great physical health. It didn't seem like he did. Paul's thorn in his flesh was for his own protection. And it's true, we are our own worst enemy to a large extent. Paul's thorn in the flesh was for this reason, to keep him from being destroyed by the sin of pride. So Paul was saying, I can't continue to live my life for the Lord if I'm number one. Christ has got to be number one. And He's doing some incredible things through me and in me, giving me these great visions and revelations, and I'm seeing a very fruitful ministry. And God doesn't want me to become prideful. And this is really where you can really tell what I believe. When you look at biblical things and you look at believers today, when you see pride in their life, it is so easy to become prideful. It is so easy to think that I have arrived and I am somebody, and look at how special I am. Even and by our own terms of success, we'd say, what a great, incredible, successful ministry. If they have no pain in their life or problem in their life, you have to really wonder if they're able to keep pride out, because I'm no different than Paul, and neither are you different than Paul. We are all prone to pride, that original sin that comes up in our life. It was to keep Paul from being destroyed by the sin of pride. Paul didn't like it, but he had to accept it. And he prayed for it to be taken away. You know, growing closer to God can come at a price. I've talked to you a lot about Ardith and David Hoeksema, some friends of mine in our church in Des Moines. And David, he moved out when he was 17. And David never made a bad decision in his life. He married right. He had the right kids. He made the right business decisions, the right education. I remember at his house in outside of Des Moines, he had this beautiful farm, and it was an incredible place. And I remember him showing me a portfolio of a premier signature home in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, outside Minneapolis, that he had sold. That was his, and he goes, oh, here was the house that we used to have in Minneapolis. And I remember looking at this 8-page brochure, full-color brochure of his home and property in Minneapolis. I mean, this guy was incredibly successful. And then, for whatever reason, God allowed his 14-year-old daughter to be killed by a guy, rear-ended them and killed his 14-year-old daughter as she was in the back seat of a car at a four-way stop. The guy was on meth, and he rear-ended her in a four-wheel drive pickup and killed his beautiful, beautiful daughter, 14 years old. And David said, Jerry, I don't know how to deal with discouragement and pain in my life, because I've never had it. Everything I've touched has turned to gold. And then God allows this. And he said to me, you know what it's like? And we dealt with this over and over and over in meetings after meetings after meetings and times of prayer and crying and just trying to listen and to be there for him. He said, you know what it's like? It'd be like me saying to you, hey, let me take your daughter Abby and keep her for the day. And then I just allow her to be killed under my watch. That's what I feel like God has done for me. I gave him my daughter. I dedicated my children to him. And I have served God with everything that I know how. And this is what God has done in my life. So we've all got pain. We've all got some kind of struggle. But growing closer to God can often come at a price. They don't hear this in casual Christianity. We don't even want to accept this as followers of Jesus Christ because we just want God to be good all the time and only have good things happen. But sadly, we don't learn that way. Pain, struggle, uncertainty, because God wants us to live our Christian life by faith. Not by sight, not by what we understand. He wants us to live that life by faith. Don't you think this thorn in the flesh tethered Paul to God? He had to be completely dependent upon him. He had to rely on him. And the success Paul was having, the revelations, the visions, the success in the churches was not because of Paul. It was because of God working in Paul and keeping Paul down. Keeping Paul aside. Making Paul less. Our response has got to be faith. God knows best. God knows what is needed. God knows the reason. And we have to trust him even in difficult times. Now, Paul knew that God had given him this thorn and this phrase from a messenger of Satan. I said last week, I think a lot of times we give Satan credit for things that God does. And we give God credit for things that Satan does. Paul knew that God gave him this thorn in the flesh and he called it a messenger of Satan was sent to me. Think about that. This will tear apart your deep theological belief system. A messenger of Satan. Satan's attacks on believers do not take place outside of God's will. They don't. Now, they may, in our tidy little preaching, in our tidy little lives, we may want to think that, but they don't happen outside of God's will. You understand the two forces. There is God and there is Satan. There is light and there is darkness. There's good and there's evil, but they are not equal. It's not like God is versing Satan. God doesn't verse anyone. There's no equal to God. Satan is against God, but there is no reciprocation in that because it's no contest. It is no contest. God controls Satan, and he even can use Satan for his purposes. So Satan pierces us with a thorn from God? Yes. It could be. Does this bother you on any level? Does it make you uncomfortable? It certainly makes me uncomfortable. It bothers me that this truth, even more, it didn't seem to bother Paul. Paul understood it and he talks about it and he just mentions it. He writes it to the Corinthian church like everybody would understand that this is the way things happen in life. Now, why would he have that understanding? Because he knew the Old Testament. He knew the Scripture. He knew the saints of old, where they struggled all of the time and how evil came about into their life from this fallen world and from Satan, from the prince of the power of this air. And so he understood that Satan was alive and well and that God was greater than Satan and even used him for his purposes. So, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, probably the other most well-known afflicted person in the Bible that God used greatly was Joseph. And at the end of his life, right before he died, he said, "You meant it for evil against me, but God meant it for good." Now, God allowed that evil to happen in his life. But also, if you just go to the very end of this whole story and the crux of this whole story, we know that God uses evil means for good things because the greatest pain in history, which was the death of Jesus Christ, was through the most evil means. Through Satan. Going through and seeing the Jews crucify Jesus Christ. So, Paul understood this and it was evident in his life. He was another example to this. But God is so powerful and He is so wise that He can work all things, including satanically delivered thorns, for our good. If you haven't memorized the scripture, Romans 8:28, you need to do that. If you're a young believer, if you don't know this passage of scripture, you need to commit it to memory. It needs to become a part of your spiritual vocabulary, Romans 8:28. For we know that all things work together for good to them that are loved, them that love God, and them that are called according to His purpose. So you need to memorize that verse, because Paul wrote that to the church at Rome, because Paul understood that all things that come into our lives, whether I'm shipwrecked, whether I'm beaten, whether I'm left for dead, whether I've got this thorn in the flesh, and I prayed that God would deliver it from me 3 times, and He hasn't. Regardless of all that, I know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them that are called according to His purpose. Understand that for our good. For your good. And this isn't going to be something that we like. It's not going to be something that is pleasant, but it is for our good. Scars remind us that God is working. We can trust Him, and when we trust in Him, we learn about His sovereignty, and we can trust in His sovereignty. This trust can bring great joy and confidence in our lives, contentedness in our lives, that we are experiencing weakness and weariness, and even though in affliction we can have great joy and comfort knowing that God is working in our life. But Paul prayed, God, please take this thorn away, and he prayed it 3 times. It's amazing that Paul only prayed this 3 times. It was like after the 3rd time he knew what the answer was. God had given him his answer and he just accepted it. I'm not going to pray about it anymore. That's not me, man. I pray about my pain and my afflictions all the time. Things that I don't like in my life, I pray about them all the time. They're forever on my tongue. But God said to him, my grace is sufficient for you. This was God's answer to his prayer. Take this thorn away from me, God. God said, my grace is sufficient for you. In other words, my presence is the difference in your life. I am there in your life. I am with you in this life, and you need to rely on me. You need to be tethered to me. It's like God is saying, you don't need relief from the pain. You need something that keeps you connected to me and makes you dependent upon me. We all need something that keeps us on our knees. And you'll see every stage of life, there's always something. There's always something that keeps us on our knees. When Abby started school in Des Moines, she was going into kindergarten. And this was back in the days when you could walk your kid all the way to class. And I would walk Abby to class for that first week. You know, all the parents were walking their kids to class. And of course, Abby, you know, was all decorated up in these zoo doodle outfits or something. Sandy would buy those little outfits. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about. Those little girl outfits. She'd have this matching bow thing on, and you know, just so cute. Walk her to class, and it was just awesome. Well, then after first couple days, I didn't do that anymore. I just drop her off like a big girl, and she would walk in. Abby thought after her first day of kindergarten that she was done with school. We said, no, you got to go back tomorrow. She goes, so first grade's tomorrow? No, you got to go for a whole year. Whole year for kindergarten. You won't be done until like May. She's like, what? Anyway, Abby developed an incredible phobia to a girl who was like in 4th or 5th grade. That was in the elementary school. And here's how it came about. After she'd been in school for several months, she was in the cafeteria. And this all came out over time. She was in the cafeteria and she was eating, and this little girl was on a couple tables away. And Abby happened to look over at her, and she looked at Abby, and Abby said she gave her a mean face. And it made Abby scared of this little girl. And this girl was bigger and older. And I'm not making this up. This is a true story. We can go to her yearbook, and Abby drew fangs on this little girl in the picture. And she blacked it out because she hated this little girl. And you can ask Abby today, Abby, what is her expression when she smiles? And she goes, that's her smile. Abby just thought she was evil, and she hated her. And pretty soon, Abby's like begging me to walk her to class. Daddy, walk me to class. That girl's going to be there. I know she's going to be there in the hallway. Walk me to class. So I walk her to class, sometimes, and you could feel Abby visibly trembling when we would go walking by that hallway where she was, and Abby would go to whatever side of me that other girl was in, and then like run into her room. I mean, it became a real problem. So, being the fixer, I called the counselor, and I said, got a weird situation going on here. And I explained her the situation. She goes, okay, we'll take care of it. We'll take care of it. So she brought in this little girl, the mean little girl with the fangs, you know, and the horns on her, the heavy drum. She brought her into the counselor's office during class.